The rain hammered down on Route 128 like 1,000 fists against glass. 3 in the morning. 3:22, to be exact. The asphalt gleamed black and endless beneath the neon glow of a distant gas station sign, and in the middle of that empty street, in the hammering storm, a woman stood in a fighting stance with her fists raised. Aria Cole. 32 years old, but the weight she carried made her look closer to 50. Her jeans were torn at both knees, soaked through and clinging to her thin legs like a second skin. Her jacket hung open, wet and heavy, revealing a white tank top that stuck to her ribs and collarbones. Her dark hair, matted from the rain, plastered across a face marked by sleepless nights and grinding fear. Her hands were steady, though. Despite the storm, despite the cold, despite everything, her hands did not shake. Across from her stood Derek Collins. 28 years old, silver Rolex catching the light on his wrist, Italian loafers that cost $300 polished to a mirror shine even in the rain. He was smiling. That smile was the kind that comes before cruelty, the smile of someone who had never been told no and did not believe the word existed. Behind him stood 3 of his men. Broad-shouldered, hands resting on their jacket fronts where their pistols Saturday. They were watching with confusion etched into their faces, because what they were witnessing made no sense. A woman half their size, soaking wet, standing alone against 4 men in the middle of the night. But the real shock was 10 feet away, beside the black SUV with its engine still running. Salvatore Corsetti. He was 56 years old and looked like the kind of man who had seen things that would break most people and decided to use those breaks to sharpen himself instead. 6 feet 2 inches tall, built broad across the shoulders like a stone fortress. His dark suit, cashmere and tailored and worth more than everything Aria owned, hung perfectly despite the rain. His dark hair was swept back from a face carved by decades of power and control, with a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye to his jaw like a blade had once tried to cut through him and failed. His eyes were the color of storm clouds gathering before lightning strikes, and right now those eyes were fixed on Aria with an intensity that made the air around him feel dangerous. Vinny stood to his left, a man in his 40s with gray creeping into his temples and a gold chain visible beneath his open white shirt. Franco stood to his right, younger, maybe 35, his jaw clenched tight. Both men had their hands loose at their sides, not reaching for weapons but ready, always ready. Salvatore's arms were crossed over his chest. He had not moved in over a minute. He was simply watching. Derek laughed. The sound cut through the rain like a knife through fabric, sharp and ugly. "You want her?" he called out, his voice dripping with confidence and cruelty. "Go ahead, boss. Take her. She's nobody. Just a waitress with a dead car and empty pockets. She owes people money she can't pay. In 2 weeks, she won't even have custody of her daughter anymore. Watch her disappear." Salvatore did not respond immediately. The silence stretched. It was the kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on you and makes it hard to breathe. Then his voice came. It was deep and solid like an oath carved into stone, and it carried across the rain without raising in volume, which somehow made it more terrifying than a shout. "You want her," he said, and his eyes still had not left Aria's face. "You go through her first. She accepts the challenge." Aria's hands did not lower. Her breathing was steady. She did not flinch. She did not look away from Derek, and Derek's smile faltered, just for a second, before he forced it back into place. "You're bluffing," Derek said, but his voice had changed. The absolute certainty was gone. Aria took a single step forward. The water splashed beneath her feet. The sound of her footstep on the rain-slicked asphalt seemed to echo despite the storm. Derek's men shifted their weight. Their hands moved closer to their sides. But what she did not know, standing there in that moment with the rain pouring down and her breath rising in cold clouds in front of her face, was that this moment began 14 hours earlier. This moment was born on a sunny afternoon when a woman with $5 in her pocket and nowhere left to turn watched her car cough once, twice, and then die on the shoulder of a highway with 2 weeks left before everything was taken from her. This moment, at 3:22 in the morning, with Salvatore Corsetti watching her with those storm cloud eyes and Derek Collins facing a woman who had nothing left to lose, had begun at 1:47 in the afternoon when Aria's life had already reached the bottom and then someone told her to dig deeper. The rain continued to fall. The neon sign continued to glow in the distance. Salvatore's men continued to watch in complete and total disbelief. Because in 15 years of working for Salvatore Corsetti, neither Vinny nor Franco had ever seen him do what he was about to do. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone you love and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Every comment you leave means everything to us. Now, let us go back to the beginning. 14 hours earlier. 1:47 in the afternoon. The summer sun beat down on Route 128 with the kind of relentless heat that makes the asphalt shimmer like water. Aria's car had been a 2009 Hyundai Elantra. Silver paint faded to the color of old bones. The check engine light had been on for 3 months. She could not afford to have it checked. Could not afford the repairs. Could not afford to fix the air conditioning, which meant the windows stayed rolled down in this heat, which meant every car that passed her left grit and dust in her hair and on her clothes. The death of the engine was not a surprise. It was a confirmation of something she had already known. The world was not kind to people like her. The world took what little you had and then took more. Aria turned the key one more time. The engine coughed, a sad rattling sound, and then went silent. She sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel, not moving, not speaking. On the passenger seat beside her was a manila envelope. Final notice was stamped across it in red ink so bright it looked like blood. Inside that envelope was a letter telling her that she owed $65,000 to people who did not accept payment plans. Inside that envelope was a deadline. 14 days. In her jacket pocket was a $5 bill. $5 to her name. The highway stretched in both directions with no other cars visible. Just heat and asphalt and silence broken only by the sound of wind rushing past the occasional vehicle speeding past her on the road. Aria reached into her pocket and pulled out the $5 bill. She held it up and looked at it. A president's face stared back at her from the worn paper. She wondered what it would be like to never have to think about money. To never do the mathematics in her head before eating. $5. How many miles would that take her? How many hours could she sit here before something had to happen? She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there was a black SUV hydroplaning toward her on the wet asphalt. No. Not wet. The road was dry. But the SUV was moving too fast, tires gripping and gripping again as it fought the driver's attempt to slow it down. Behind the SUV were 2 more black vehicles. All of them decelerating, all of them heading toward her with purpose. Aria's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The lead SUV pulled to a stop 15 feet in front of her, blocking her view of the road ahead. The second vehicle stopped beside it. The third vehicle pulled up behind, cutting off her exit. She was boxed in. The driver's side door of the lead SUV opened. A man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that moved with him like it was part of his skin. His dark hair was perfectly maintained despite the heat. His face was calm and controlled and held no emotion at all. This was Vinny. Not the leader. But the kind of man who had killed people and slept soundly the next night. He approached her car slowly, each step deliberate and measured, and he was not alone. Franco stepped out of the second SUV. 3 other men emerged from the vehicles and stood with their hands loose at their sides, positioned in a loose semicircle around her car. Aria did not get out. She sat in her seat with her hand still on the wheel, and she waited. Vinny leaned down and looked through the driver's side window. He was in his 40s, with grey touching his temples and a gold chain visible beneath his open white shirt. His eyes were the color of wet concrete, and they looked at her without any particular emotion, as if she were a thing to be evaluated rather than a person to be acknowledged. He gestured. 1 finger. Get out. Aria opened the door and stepped onto the asphalt. The heat hit her immediately, pressing down like a weight. She was wearing a white tank top and torn jeans, and the fabric of her clothes seemed to cling to her body like a second skin. "Your name," Vinny said. His voice was rough, textured, the voice of a man who smoked too many cigarettes and made too many threats. "Aria Cole," she said. "You owe money, Aria Cole." It was not a question. "Yes," she said. $65,000. "Yes." To people who do not forgive debt. Aria did not respond. Vinny circled around her slowly. His footsteps made soft sounds on the asphalt. Franco watched from his position by the second vehicle, his expression unreadable. "You have 14 days, Vinny said. You do not have that money. You will not get that money. So either your daughter disappears into the system, or you disappear. Those are the choices." Aria's hands curled into fists. "We are not here to kill you," Vinny continued. "We are here to deliver a message. Our boss is considering something. He is considering whether you are worth saving. Whether your daughter is worth saving." He stopped in front of her. His hand reached out and took the $5 bill from her other hand. She had not even realized she was still holding it. "You have 14 days, he said again. And then he walked back toward the vehicles. The three men who had been standing in the semicircle moved with him. Franco gave her one last look, and then he was gone. The doors closed. The engine started. The three black SUVs pulled back onto the highway and accelerated into the distance, leaving her standing alone on the shoulder with her dead car and her racing heart and no money at all. Aria stood in the summer heat for 3 minutes without moving. Then she sat back down in her car and waited for something to happen. She did not know what. She did not know that at that exact moment, in a downtown Boston office that occupied the entire 42nd floor of a glass and steel building, a man named Salvatore Corsetti was being told about a woman with a dead car and a debt she could not pay. She did not know what was coming. All she knew was that her car was dead, her money was gone, and somewhere in the distance, her daughter was waiting for her to come home. The summer heat pressed down on Route 128 like a hand closing around her throat. Aria Cole sat in her 2008 Honda Civic with both windows down, the air conditioning long dead like everything else in her life, and watched the fuel gauge needle drop past empty. The engine made a sound like something breaking inside, a grinding that turned into a cough, and then nothing. Silence. The worst sound of all. She turned the key. Click. Nothing. She turned it again. Click. And again. Click. The steering wheel was slick under her palms. Sweat or rain, she could not tell anymore. One $5 bill in her wallet. That was the mathematics of her entire existence now. $5 to her name, and a daughter waiting at her mother's house, and 14 days before people who did not accept payment plans came to collect what Marcus had left her with when he died 6 months ago. The debt letter in her jacket pocket was already damp. She had stopped trying to keep it dry. Final notice, it read. $65,000. 14 days remaining. The number swam in front of her eyes the way they had every morning when she woke up, the way they would every morning for 13 more days if she lived that long. Grey clouds had been gathering since she left the diner at 2 in the afternoon. She had worked a double shift, had served 43 people, had been tipped exactly $8.73. The manager had let her take home the salad that nobody ordered, the one with the brown lettuce, and she had eaten it in the break room and tried not to think about Ava asking for chicken nuggets. Now the clouds were opening. Summer thunderstorm, the kind that came without warning in New England, the kind that turned the sky from gray to black in the space of a heartbeat. Lightning cracked open the horizon. The sound of it reached her 3 seconds later, thunder that rolled across the asphalt like an avalanche. Rain came. Not drops. Not a downpour. Rain came like a wall, like the sky was emptying itself directly onto her car, onto the highway, onto her soaked skin and soaked clothes and soaked hair. She was drenched within 30 seconds. Within a minute, the inside of the car was humid and cold and smelled like wet fabric and despair. She opened the door and stepped out into the storm. A semi-truck passed at 70 miles per hour, throwing a wake of water that knocked her sideways. The driver did not even slow down. She stood on the shoulder with her thumb out, shaking, watching the red taillights disappear into the rain. A sedan passed. Then another. Nobody stopped. Nobody slowed down. In the world's economy, she was worth nothing. She could stand here and die and the highway would not even notice. At 2:41 in the afternoon, 3 black SUVs appeared in the distance. They were moving fast, too fast for the weather, their headlights cutting through the rain like knives through silk. The first vehicle hydroplaned slightly as it approached, tires losing grip for a half second, then found purchase and straightened. All 3 vehicles slowed. The lead SUV's brake lights ignited red in the storm. Then the middle vehicle pulled smoothly onto the shoulder ahead of her car. The driver's side door opened. The man who stepped out wore a black suit that somehow remained untouched by rain, as if the water itself understood not to soil him. His shirt was white, open at the collar, and his chest was broad and unmarked by time or struggle. Salt and pepper hair, wet now but still perfectly ordered. His face was the face of a general surveying a conquered city, and his eyes were storm gray, the color of this very sky, and they held depths that suggested he had seen things that would break ordinary people into pieces. Aria knew who he was before he opened his mouth. She did not know his name yet. But she knew. Behind him, 2 other men emerged from the vehicle. One had a scar that ran from his left eye to his jawline, a pale line against olive skin. The other was broader, younger, with hands that stayed near his body in a way that suggested they had killed people. They wore the same black suits. They moved the same way, deliberate, controlled, every gesture calculated. The man in the middle, the one who had stepped out first, looked at her car. Then he looked at her. His gaze moved across her wet clothes, her bare arms, the way she was shaking, the $5 bill she was still holding in her closed fist. "You need help," he said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath. Like something that could not be broken. Aria's throat was dry. It had been dry for 6 months, since the day she got the call about Marcus. Since the day she learned about the money. Since the day she understood that her life had ended and she simply had not stopped breathing yet. "My car," she managed. "Your car is dead," the man said. He was not being cruel. He was stating a fact the way one might state that the sky is blue or that people die. "Where were you going?" "Home," Aria whispered. The scar-faced man, Vinny, turned to the other one, Franco. They exchanged a look that lasted 2 seconds. In that look, something passed between them. A question. An answer. A decision made. "Get in," the man said, and he was already walking back to the middle SUV. Aria did not move. Every cell in her body was screaming not to move, not to go anywhere with these people, not to trust anything about this moment. But her car was dead. She had $5. She had a daughter. She had 14 days. She walked to the SUV. Franco held the rear door open. She climbed inside. The interior smelled like leather and expensive cologne and something underneath both of those things, something like gunpowder or thunder or the particular scent of a man who had made a career out of violence. The seats were warm. There was bottled water in the cup holder. A phone sat on the console, the kind that cost more than everything she owned. Vinny was already driving. Franco sat in the passenger seat. The man, the one whose eyes held entire empires, sat beside her in the back. "What is your name?" he asked. "Aria," she whispered. "Aria Cole." "I am Salvatore," he said. "These are Vinny and Franco. We are going to help you." The rain hammered against the windows. The windshield wipers could not keep up with the volume of water falling from the sky. Vinny drove with one hand, casual, unconcerned by the weather or the fact that the road had become a river. "How old is your daughter?" Salvatore asked. Aria's head snapped toward him. How did you? The way you looked when you said home, he said. A daughter. Ava, Aria said. She is 7. And her father? Dead. 6 months ago. Salvatore looked forward. The muscle in his jaw tightened. What was his name? Marcus. And did Marcus leave you with anything besides a daughter? The rain continued its assault on the world. Aria could see the highway behind them, empty now, the shoulder where her car sat dead and useless, disappearing into the grey curtain of the storm. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the letter. It was soaked through, the ink running slightly, but the words were still legible. Final notice. $65,000. 14 days. She handed it to him. Salvatore took the letter. His hands were large, with a gold ring on his right ring finger and a platinum watch on his left wrist that cost more than Aria's entire life was worth. He read the letter slowly, letting the wet paper drip onto his expensive suit, and he did not seem to care. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. You owe this money to whom? He asked. Loan sharks, Aria said. Marcus borrowed from them 3 years ago. They keep adding interest. They keep saying he was supposed to pay it back. Now they say I have 14 days or they are going to take Ava. The words came out in a flood, all the terror and despair of the past 6 months spilling out like the rain was spilling out of the sky. She could not stop them. I work 2 shifts at a diner. I make maybe $200 a week. Even if I worked every single day, I cannot make $65,000 in 14 days. I cannot make it in 14 months. I cannot make it ever. They are going to take my daughter and I am going to be alone and there is nothing I can do about it. Silence filled the SUV. The only sound was the rain and the windshield wipers and the engine carrying them through the storm. What is your mother's address? Salvatore asked. Aria gave it to him, mechanically. She had no idea why she was telling this man anything. But he had come out of the rain. He had stopped. He was listening. Vinny turned the vehicle. Salvatore pulled out his phone and spoke into it, his voice carrying instructions that meant nothing to her. 10 minutes later, the SUV pulled onto a residential street lined with modest homes, the kind of street where people like Aria lived, where everything was small and worn and struggling to hold itself together. The SUV stopped in front of her mother's house. Thank you, Aria said, because she could not imagine what else to say to a man like this. Salvatore looked at her. In his eyes, something shifted. Something broke open, just for a moment, something that suggested he was remembering someone, losing someone, something that left a scar across his chest that no one could see. What you have done, he said slowly, is survived. Do not stop now. She climbed out of the SUV into the rain. Ava was waiting inside that small house, and Aria had come back from the dead, had made it home. She turned to look back at the vehicle. Salvatore was watching her through the window. Franco was watching her. Vinny was watching her. 200 yards back, in a sedan parked where the rain made everything invisible, Derek Collins sat with his phone in his hand and a plan forming in his mind, a plan that would use this woman like a knife, like a weapon, like a way to wound Salvatore Corsetti from the inside out. The black SUV pulled away from the restaurant into the rain-soaked Boston night. Aria sat rigid on the leather seat, water still dripping from her hair onto the upholstery, creating dark spots like tears on a stone. Salvatore sat beside her now, not across from her. He had moved when Derek left, had closed the distance between them without asking permission, and she had not pulled away. In 12 years working for this man, Vinny had never seen him sit beside anyone like that. Franco, watching from the front seat, said nothing. Neither did Vinny. Some things did not require words. The loan sharks, Salvatore said quietly. Who do they work for? Aria's hands trembled. A man named Raymond Giacomo. He runs the collections out of a warehouse in Southie. They said, her voice cracked. They said if I do not pay by the deadline, they will take Ava. Salvatore's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone, black and expensive and serious like everything else he owned. He made one call. Find Raymond Giacomo's operation. Send Marco and the crew. Lock it down. No one moves money in or out of that warehouse. No one. He paused. And find out who is holding the actual debt instruments. I want names. The line went dead. He turned to look at Aria. In his eyes, something shifted again, something that suggested he was remembering someone he had lost, someone he could not save, a wound that would never fully close. I do not know who you are, Aria whispered. My name is Salvatore Corsetti. This is my city. And you are no longer alone in this. The SUV turned onto Route 128, heading east. Rain hammered the windows. At 11:04 p.m., Salvatore asked Aria where she wanted to go. She gave him the address of a motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where rooms rented by the week and nobody asked questions. He told Vinny to drive past it. You are not staying there, he said. It was not a question. I cannot afford anywhere else. The car repair alone is already paid. You will stay at my property in Back Bay. One night. Ava will have a safe place to sleep. You will have time to breathe. He looked away from her toward the rain-streaked window. I lost someone I was supposed to protect. I have no intention of watching it happen again. Aria did not argue. She had run out of argument somewhere between the restaurant and the rain. 30 minutes later, the convoy pulled up to a brownstone mansion on Louisburg Square, 6 stories of brick and history and money that she could never have imagined. A woman named Catherine, silver-haired and kind, was waiting at the door. Salvatore spoke to her in Italian. Catherine nodded and took Aria upstairs to a room that was bigger than her entire apartment, with a bed the size of a boat and a window overlooking the city lights blurred by rain. Your daughter is in the room next door, Catherine said in a soft accent. She is sleeping now. Your clothes will be washed and dried by morning. There is anything you need, you ring this bell. Aria looked at the golden bell on the nightstand. She had never seen anything like it outside of movies. At 1:22 a.m., in a penthouse apartment on Newbury Street, Sophie Langford stood at a floor-to-ceiling window and looked at the same rain falling on the same city. On her phone, she held the photograph that Derek Collins had sent her. Aria Cole, leaving Salvatore's restaurant, her dark hair wet, wearing a man's jacket that cost more than a year of her old rent. Sophie's face went perfectly still. She had wanted Salvatore Corsetti for 6 years. She had attended every function where he appeared, had engineered 3 accidental meetings, had made it very clear that she was interested and available and from a family that could actually stand beside his. And every single time, he had smiled that terrible smile and changed the subject. No thank you. Not interested. Untouchable. And now this. This woman who looked like she had been pulled out of a dumpster, sitting across from him at his private table, and Salvatore was looking at her like she was something precious. Sophie made a call. The line picked up on the first ring. I need everything, Sophie said. Employment history, financial records, social media, past relationships, police reports, hospital visits, everything. I need to know every embarrassing thing this woman has ever done. Every moment she failed. Every way she is broken. The voice on the other end was professional, efficient. How quickly? By tomorrow morning. And then I need you to spread it. Post it everywhere. Make sure everyone sees what kind of person Salvatore is protecting. Make her toxic. Make her dangerous. Make him regret ever looking at her. The call ended. Back at the mansion, Aria lay in the darkness of the enormous bed and listened to the rain. Through the window between the 2 rooms, she could hear Ava breathing softly, finally sleeping somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere that did not smell like mold and desperation. She thought about the man downstairs. She thought about the way he had looked at her scars. She thought about the way he had said, "I have no intention of watching it happen again." She did not know that Derek Collins was already in motion, that at 2:33 a.m. he was meeting with 3 men in a parking garage in Dorchester, planning something that would change everything. She did not know that Sophie Langford's information operatives were already digging through public records and private databases, gathering ammunition. She did not know that by morning, the very act of her getting into that SUV would have become a weapon pointed directly at her heart. What she did know was that her phone was on the nightstand, and the debt collector's number was still in her call history, and somewhere in this city, men were waiting for the clock to count down to 0. She knew that Ava was finally safe for one more night. She did not know it would be the last peaceful night either of them would have for a very long time. Downstairs, Salvatore sat in his study, the walls lined with books he never read, and made phone calls. Marco, his fixer, answered on the first ring, always awake, always ready. Salvatore told him to find everything about Aria Cole's husband, everything about the loans, everything about the men who had hurt her. "There is a child," Salvatore said quietly. 7 years old. Female. She will need to be protected. Understood. Understood, boss, Marco said. The calls continued. By 3:15 a.m., Salvatore Corsetti had set in motion a series of events that his own men did not fully understand. They knew only that something had shifted in him, that the widow from the rain had cracked something open that had been sealed for 8 years, that their boss, untouchable, impenetrable, alone, was no longer choosing to be alone. Franco stood in the hallway outside the study. He had worked for Salvatore for 15 years, had seen him destroy empires and forgive no one, had believed the man was incapable of softness. But he had seen Salvatore help Aria back into the SUV. He had seen the way Salvatore looked at the scar on her wrist. He had heard the tone in his voice when he said, "I have no intention of watching it happen again." Franco understood what it meant. It meant war was coming. Not with Raymond Giacomo and his loan sharks. That would be finished by sunrise. This was something else. This was about Derek Collins, who thought he could use a widow as leverage. This was about Sophie Langford, who thought she could destroy someone Salvatore had decided to protect. This was about something that Franco had not seen in his boss's eyes since the day they buried a baby in a cemetery on the north side of the city. This was about love. And love, Franco knew, was the most dangerous weapon any man could carry. The rain continued. In every part of the city, in every direction, the wheels were turning. Derek was planning. Sophie was gathering information. Marco was investigating. And upstairs in the mansion, Aria Cole lay in a bed that felt like floating on a cloud, her daughter breathing safely in the next room, not knowing that by tomorrow afternoon, her entire life would be under siege, that the act of accepting help from Salvatore Corsetti would make her a target, that the next 72 hours would strip away everything she thought she knew about survival and force her to discover what she was truly capable of. At 5:38 a.m., as the first grey light touched the edges of the rain clouds, Salvatore finally went to bed. But he did not sleep. He lay in darkness in a room that had not held another person in 8 years and thought about a widow with a trembling hand and scars that ran like a map of every way the world had tried to break her. And he thought, not anymore. Never again. 7 days later, at 2:15 in the afternoon, Aria Cole stood behind the counter of Donovan's Diner on Atlantic Avenue, wiping down the espresso machine, when her manager approached with an expression like a man about to deliver a death sentence. His name was Tom, 53 years old, with tired eyes and the permanent slouch of someone who had spent 30 years apologizing for things that were not his fault. He did not meet her gaze. He simply placed an envelope on the counter and said, "I am sorry, Aria. I am so sorry. But I cannot have you here anymore. Not after the calls I received this morning." She opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was her final paycheck, $187 for 3 days of work, and a termination letter dated that morning. "What calls?" she whispered. Tom's jaw tightened. "A woman. Sophie Langford. She said if I kept you employed, there would be consequences." She said you were. She said things about you that I could not repeat to my wife. She said Salvatore Corsetti's name like it was a threat. Aria, I believe in you, but I cannot risk my business, my reputation, my family. I am sorry. The diner around her seemed to tilt. Through the front windows, she could see the afternoon rain beginning to fall, turning the Boston streets dark as bruises. By 11 in the afternoon, Aria picked up Ava from school, her daughter's small hand warm in hers as they walked toward the parking lot where the second disaster was waiting. Derek Collins stood beside a black Mercedes, dressed in a gray cashmere coat that probably cost more than Aria had earned in her entire life. He was 34 years old, handsome in the way that predators often are, sharp features, sharp eyes, the kind of smile that made your instincts scream warnings your brain could not quite articulate. Ava saw him and immediately moved closer to her mother, sensing something wrong the way children sense storms before they break. Derek smiled wider. Your daughter is beautiful, he said, his voice smooth as silk soaked in poison. It would be a tremendous shame if something happened while you cannot pay your debts. Tragic, really. Children need their mothers. The words hit like bullets, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. Aria stepped forward, placing herself entirely between Derek and her daughter, and something in her voice transformed. It became a blade wrapped in ice. Touch her and I will kill you myself. I swear on everything I have left. Derek laughed. The sound was like breaking glass. Brave words from a woman with $5 to her name and nowhere to run. You cannot even pay rent, Aria. How exactly do you plan to kill me? Your uncle's money? Your new boyfriend's protection? He cannot help you forever. Men like Salvatore Corsetti do not keep strays. Eventually, he will tire of you, and then you will be alone again. And when you are alone, I will come for what is owed. He drove away at 4:52, leaving her standing in the rain with her daughter trembling against her leg. By 6:33 in the evening, the third strike came. Sophie Langford stood outside Aria's apartment building with two women beside her, both holding phones filming, both smiling like hyenas who had caught the scent of blood. Sophie wore a cream-colored Chanel dress worth more than Aria's monthly rent used to be, her blonde hair arranged in perfect waves, her face arranged in an expression of righteous fury. You are a gold-digging whore, Sophie said, her voice carrying across the parking lot so that everyone within a block could hear her. Using Salvatore Corsetti. Climbing into his bed to steal from him. Stay away from him or I will make sure you lose your daughter. I have lawyers. I have connections. I have documentation of your abusive relationship with your ex-husband. How long do you think you would last in a custody battle? 1 week? 2. The rain began to fall harder, drenching Sophie's perfect dress, and she did not seem to notice or care. Aria said nothing. She simply stood there while the cameras filmed, while the words poured like acid, while the woman who had everything used that everything like a weapon against someone who had nothing. That night, at 11:53 in the evening, Aria sat on the dark floor of her apartment with the door locked and all the lights off, Ava asleep in the bedroom behind a closed door. The debt letter sat in her lap. The deadline was 3 days away. The numbers were still impossible. The situation was still intractable. But now there was something else. There was no job. There was no income. There was nothing between her and drowning but the current moment, and the current moment was drowning her. Her hands shook as she held her phone. She thought about running. She could take Ava in the middle of the night, get on a bus with $5, disappear into some other city where nobody knew her name. But Derek's words echoed, he would find her. Sophie's threat echoed, the courts would take Ava away. Where could a woman go when the entire world was a trap? The scars on her spine, the ones that mapped out 8 years of systematic cruelty from her ex-husband, began to ache the way they always did when she was terrified. Her body remembered pain the way other people remembered phone numbers. She closed her eyes. She prepared to surrender. Then Ava coughed softly in her sleep, a small, fragile sound from the next room. Something hardened inside Aria's chest. Not hope. Not yet. But something that felt like defiance. She had survived 8 years of abuse that taught her how to disappear, how to swallow pain, how to become invisible in her own life. She had survived poverty that stripped everything except breath and will. She had survived the moment when her ex-husband left her with a debt so enormous it seemed designed by the universe itself to break her. And she had not survived all of that just to surrender to Derek Collins and Sophie Langford. She opened her eyes. At 12:03 in the morning, she called Salvatore. He answered before the second ring, as if he had been waiting for her to call, as if some part of him had been holding his breath since the moment she walked into his life. "Aria," he said, and his voice was solid as stone. "What has happened?" She told him. She told him about the diner, about Derek's threat, about Sophie's public cruelty, about the deadline arriving in 3 days with no way to meet it. She told him everything, and she expected him to become angry, to become cold, to realize she was too much trouble, too much damage, not worth the complication. Instead, he said, "You are safe. My men are coming to you now. Stay in the apartment. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone except the men I am sending. We are coming to you, and then no one will hurt you or Ava ever again. I swear this on my life." At 3:11 in the morning, 12 men in black tactical gear moved like ghosts through Derek Collins's apartment building in the financial district. They moved with the precision of men who had done this 1,000 times, no shouting, no unnecessary force, just the absolute clarity of purpose that comes from working under a boss who does not tolerate mistakes. Salvatore Corsetti led them, moving through the darkness with his hand on the stair rail, his face carved from ice, his eyes containing something that made even these hardened men move faster. They had everything they needed. The FBI had been building their case against Derek for 3 years, racketeering, human trafficking, wire fraud, money laundering running back almost a decade. But they had been missing the final pieces, the connections, the money trails that would prove it beyond reasonable doubt. Salvatore had given them everything. He had handed over years of intelligence, photographs, financial records, conversations recorded, debts documented. He had done what the federal government could not do on its own. He had provided the architecture of Derek's crimes, room by room, transaction by transaction. At 5:16 in the morning, FBI agents in blue jackets stormed Derek's penthouse with warrants in their hands and determination in their eyes. Derek Collins woke to the sound of his bedroom door being kicked open, to the sensation of hard hands grabbing his arms, to the sight of flashlights and gun barrels cutting through the darkness. By 5:51, he was on his knees in silk pajamas worth more than a car payment, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face pressed against the cold marble floor of his own bedroom. Salvatore Corsetti stood in the doorway watching, his expression unchanged, his presence absolute. "Uncle Sal," Derek whispered, his voice fractured like old glass. "Please. Please, I am family. We are blood." Salvatore looked at him the way a man looks at a stain he is about to clean from his shoe. "You threatened a child," he said, his voice like thunder rolling across empty fields. "You threatened a woman who was trying to survive. You are blood to nothing. You are nobody." Derek was led out of the building at 6:22 in the morning, and the news cameras were waiting like hungry animals. The federal prosecutor announced the charges in a voice that carried across every news outlet in the city: racketeering, human trafficking, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. The sentence range was laid out like a life sentence being read: minimum 40 years in federal prison, maximum 70. Derek Collins would spend the prime years of his life, the decades when a man should be living, inside concrete walls and steel bars. He collapsed in the federal van with his hands cuffed, trembling like a cornered animal, his face the color of ash, his body shaking with the specific terror of a man who had finally understood he could not buy his way out, could not talk his way out, could not leverage his way out. He was finished. At 8:15 in the morning, Sophie Langford sat at a table at the Boston Heritage Charity Brunch, surrounded by the city's elite, when the FBI agents walked in and began making arrests. Her name was called. She stood slowly, her face draining of color, her designer dress suddenly seeming like a costume from a play that had just ended. They walked her out in handcuffs in front of 300 people: lawyers, doctors, philanthropists, the entire social structure of Boston watching as Sophie Langford was led away, her reputation disintegrating in real time like paper thrown into fire. The charges were announced: money laundering through her real estate holdings, tax evasion spanning 7 years, bribery of city officials. Salvatore had given the FBI her entire financial history, every transaction, every bribe, every illegal dollar that had funded her perfect life. Her assets were frozen. Her accounts were seized. Her businesses were shut down pending investigation. Her lawyers would fight, but there was nothing to fight. The evidence was perfect, the documentation was complete, the case was airtight. By 10 o'clock that morning, every news outlet in Boston was running the story. By noon, it had reached the national networks. By evening, it was national news: the socialite brought down, the elite exposed, the criminal enterprise dismantled. Sophie Langford sat in a federal holding cell in a grey jumpsuit, and nobody who had smiled at her yesterday would speak her name today. She would spend decades in prison, watching her empire crumble, watching her perfect life become a cautionary tale, watching everything she had built become nothing. And neither Derek nor Sophie would ever touch Aria Cole again. Neither of them would ever threaten her daughter. Neither of them would ever have the power to hurt anyone ever again. The rain had stopped, but the asphalt still gleamed like black glass under the neon signs. 3:22 in the morning. Route 128 downtown, where the streets emptied out and belonged to no one. Aria Cole stood alone in the middle of the road, her hands trembling at her sides, watching the headlights of 3 vehicles approaching from the north. Derek Collins climbed out first, his jaw swollen from the federal holding cell, his eyes burning with a rage that came from losing everything. 3 men stood behind him, their shoulders broad, their movement slow and deliberate. They thought they owned the night. They thought she was still the woman they had terrified weeks ago, the woman who had flinched at every shadow. They had no idea who was parked 3 blocks away, watching, waiting to see if she would choose to let him handle this or if she would handle it herself. Derek laughed when he saw her standing there in the street. It was a cruel sound, like breaking glass. "You came alone. That is perfect. You know what I am going to do to you." His voice carried the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I am going to make sure Ava forgets your face. I am going to make sure she thinks her mother was weak, useless, forgettable." Aria did not move. The scars on her spine throbbed in the cold air, each one a roadmap of survival, each one a lesson in how to breathe through pain. 8 years of her first husband's fists had taught her something Derek would never understand: how to see the moment before the strike, how to move like water instead of stone, how to turn a man's own momentum against him. "I want to offer you a choice." Salvatore Corsetti's voice came from behind Derek, deep and solid like an oath. The black convoy had arrived silently, the engines cut, the men emerging like ghosts from the darkness. Salvatore wore a charcoal cashmere coat that cost more than Aria's annual salary. His hands were empty. His voice was not. "You want her? You go through her first. Fight her yourself, Derek. Man to woman. Here. Now." Derek's 3 associates took steps backward. They understood what was happening. They understood the calculus of power had shifted. Derek's face twisted. "What? You want me to fight her?" Salvatore's eyes moved to Aria. There was no command in his gaze, only a question. "Your choice. I can handle this, or you can." Aria thought of the night Derek's men had come to her apartment, the way they had thrown her on the bed, the way their hands had pinned her wrists. She thought of Ava sleeping in the next room, the small girl who had started having nightmares again after that visit. She thought of 8 years with a man whose fists had taught her that the only way to survive was to never let someone else own your terror again. She stepped forward into the street. "I accept," she said. Her voice was not trembling. It was steady like a blade. Vinny and Franco exchanged a look neither had seen on the other's face in 15 years. Shock. Pure, undisguised shock. Their boss had just offered a widow the choice to fight a man, and she had said yes without hesitation. Derek laughed again, but this time it was hollow. He thought it would be quick. He thought years of prison yard violence would matter against a woman half his size. He threw the first punch at 3:23 in the morning, a wild hook that came from his shoulder, all power and no precision. Aria moved. She did not block. She did not brace herself. She moved like water around his fist, and as his momentum carried him forward, she struck, palm to his throat, sharp and precise. He gasped. Before he could recover, her knee came up toward his ribs, and Derek doubled over, the air leaving his lungs in a strangled cry. She did not stop. Every strike was 8 years of abuse released. Every punch was a night she had lain awake wondering if she would survive until morning. Every kick was the moment her first husband had cornered her in the kitchen, her hands bleeding because she had tried to protect her face. The rage that came out of her was not wild, it was controlled, purposeful, devastatingly efficient. Within 45 seconds, Derek was on one knee. Within 90 seconds, he was on the ground, gasping like a fish pulled from water, his face against the wet asphalt. Aria stood over him, breathing hard, her hands shaking not from fear but from the adrenaline of 8 years finally being released into the night air. Salvatore's men did not move. They simply stared. In 15 years of working for him, they had never seen anything like this. They had never seen the boss allow a woman to fight her own battle. They had never seen a widow move like a warrior. Salvatore walked slowly to Derek and crouched beside him. His voice was quiet, which made it infinitely more terrifying than any shout could have been. Federal transport picks you up in 90 minutes. 40 years, Derek. 40 years in a cell thinking about the night a widow broke you. You will never threaten anyone again. You will die in prison, and nobody will mourn you. The FBI agents who had been waiting 3 blocks away arrived with unmarked vehicles. They lifted Derek off the asphalt, placed him in handcuffs, and drove him away. The sound of the engines faded into the early morning silence. Aria stood in the center of the street, her chest heaving, her knuckles blooded and scraped. Salvatore approached slowly, each step deliberate. "You did not need me," he said. It was not a question. She looked at him, and in that moment, something shifted. The fear that had defined her survival for 8 years was gone. What remained was something harder, clearer, more dangerous to anyone who would try to hurt her. "Yes, I did," she said. "Just not the way you think." 6 months later, the morning sun touched the edges of Boston's harbor, and Aria Cole walked into the office of Corsetti Enterprises with a key card that bore her name. Manager. Her own office. A salary that paid for Ava's tuition and left money in the bank. She had rebuilt her life with her own hands, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, decision by decision. Derek Collins was serving 40 years in a federal penitentiary in upstate New York. Sophie Langford was serving 40 years in a minimum security facility in Connecticut. Their crimes had spawned 3 podcast series and a documentary that was nominated for awards. They had become cautionary tales, warnings whispered at cocktail parties about what happens when cruelty finally catches up with the cruelty. Salvatore had kept his distance. He honored her need to stand on her own feet, to prove to herself that she could survive without relying on his power. But they met for coffee every Sunday morning at 8:51 a.m. Just the two of them. Conversations that started small and grew deeper with each passing week. "Tell me about Ava's school," he said one Sunday in November. "She made the soccer team," Aria replied, and his entire face changed. He smiled like a man who had been given permission to feel joy again. Then came the evening at 7:34 in the evening when Salvatore took her to the rooftop garden of his penthouse overlooking Boston. The sky was clear, the sun bleeding orange and gold across the western horizon. But it was not the view he had brought her there to see. It was the nursery. Blue walls. A crib that had never been used. A mobile with small wooden airplanes hanging from invisible wire. And a photograph in a silver frame with a name written in careful script beneath it, Matteo. "My son," Salvatore said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Stillborn 8 years ago. My wife and I had decorated this room. We had planned everything. And then she was gone, and he was gone, and I never dismantled it. I never moved on. I locked this door and pretended it did not exist. Aria's hand found his without thinking. I see you, she said. All of you. The man who lost a son. The man who built an empire to feel something other than that loss. The man who saw me on that rainy road and recognized something in me that needed saving. He turned to face her. His eyes were glistening, but he did not cry. Not yet. You have rebuilt your life. You stand as my equal now. And I need you to know, I did not help you because I wanted something. I helped you because you reminded me that strength is not about power. It is about surviving what should break you. I trust you, she said. That is something I never thought I would say to anyone again. When they kissed, the sun was disappearing below the horizon, and the city lights began to emerge like stars being born. 1 year later, Ava ran across a grass field with her hand held in Salvatore's. She called him Sal now, and she did not flinch when he lifted her onto his shoulders. Aria watched them from a distance, her hands resting on her own abdomen, where another life was growing. The scars on her spine had not disappeared. They would never disappear. But they were no longer wounds. They were proof. They were roads that had led her here, to this man, to this moment, to a future that did not belong to fear anymore. Every day we choose between fear and trust, between closing ourselves off and opening our hearts. I chose trust. And it gave me everything. If this story moved your heart, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of survival, redemption, and second chances that will reshape the way you see strength. Share this with someone who needs to know that the darkest moments do not define us, our choices after those moments do. Comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Aria's position? New stories drop tomorrow. See you then.